Former Arkansas Governor Mike Huckabee thought he could question Texas Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett's faith on live television. What happened next left the ordained Baptist minister completely speechless and changed everything viewers thought they knew about biblical knowledge in politics. The studio lights blazed as two political heavyweights prepared for what would become the most shocking religious debate of the year. Huckabee, with his decades of pastoral experience, sat confidently across from Crockett, the young congresswoman who was about to prove that assumptions about faith can be dangerously wrong. Before we dive into this incredible story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss these amazing political moments that are reshaping America. Huckabee had built his entire career on being the religious authority in political spaces. He'd served as a Baptist pastor for 12 years, written books about faith, and positioned himself as the voice of Christian values in conservative politics. Across from him sat Jasmine Crockett, the 43-year-old congresswoman from Texas. To many viewers, she might have seemed like an unlikely opponent in a biblical discussion, but what was about to unfold would shock everyone watching. The moderator had barely finished his introduction when Huckabee leaned forward, his trademark confident smile spreading across his face. He thought he was about to school a young politician who probably knew very little about the Bible. He had no idea he was walking into the most humiliating moment of his public career. At 69 years old, he carried the weight of decades spent as a Southern Baptist pastor, former Arkansas governor and presidential candidate. His silver hair and gentle demeanor masked a sharp political mind that had dominated religious conversations in conservative circles for over 30 years. He'd specifically requested this debate topic because he'd heard Crockett make several references to her faith during congressional hearings. Something about her approach to Christianity bothered him. He was convinced that Crockett was using faith as a political tool without really understanding what the Bible actually taught. Jasmine Crockett, meanwhile, had arrived at the studio with a quiet confidence that surprised her own team. The Texas congresswoman had graduated from law school, built a successful career as a civil rights attorney, and won her congressional seat by connecting with voters who felt overlooked by traditional politics. But what most people didn't know was the depth of her biblical knowledge. Growing up in St. Louis, Crockett hadn't just attended church. She had immersed herself in biblical study from a young age. Her grandmother, a woman who could recite entire books of the Bible from memory, had insisted that young Jasmine not just read the scriptures, but understand them in their original context. By age 15, Crockett was studying biblical Hebrew and Greek. By college, she was leading Bible study groups that attracted theology students. The stakes couldn't have been higher. This wasn't just about two politicians disagreeing on policy. This was about who had the authority to speak about faith in American politics. For conservative viewers, Huckabee represented the traditional understanding of Christianity that had guided the Republican Party for generations. For progressive viewers, Crockett represented a newer generation that saw faith and social justice as inseparable. Huckabee recovered quickly from Crockett's unexpected opening. He leaned forward with his characteristic confidence, ready to regain control. "Well, Congresswoman," he said with a slight chuckle, "that's certainly an interesting academic perspective. But let's talk about practical Christianity. Let's talk about what the Bible actually says about the issues facing America today." He paused, letting his words settle. "Now, I've been studying the Bible for over 40 years, and I've been preaching it for decades. When I look at your voting record, Congresswoman, I have to wonder if you've really spent time with Scripture, or if you're just picking and choosing verses that support your political agenda," the audience murmured. This was the kind of direct challenge they'd come to see. "For instance," Huckabee continued, "you've voted for legislation that many Christians find troubling. You've supported policies that seem to contradict traditional biblical values. Makes me wonder if you've read Romans 13, which clearly talks about God's design for government and authority." He sat back slightly, confident that he'd landed a solid blow. Romans 13 was one of his go-to passages when discussing politics and faith. Crockett didn't deflect. "Governor Huckabee," she said, her voice remaining calm but gaining a subtle edge, "I'm glad you brought up Romans 13. Let's talk about that passage, but let's talk about it in context." She leaned forward slightly. You're referring to verses 1 through 7, where Paul discusses submission to governing authorities. But I think it's important that we consider who Paul was writing to and why. This letter was written to the Roman Church around 57 AD, during the reign of Emperor Nero. Huckabee's confident expression wavered slightly. Paul wasn't endorsing every government action, Crockett continued. He was giving practical advice to a persecuted minority about how to survive under a hostile regime. And if we're going to quote Romans 13, we should also consider how it connects to Romans 12:21. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. The studio audience was completely silent now. And since you mentioned my voting record, Crockett said, let's talk about biblical priorities. When I vote for policies that provide health care for the poor, I'm thinking about Jesus' words in Matthew 25:40. Whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. Huckabee tried to interrupt, but Crockett's momentum was building. When I advocate for immigrant rights, I'm following Hebrews 13:2. Do not forget to show hospitality to strangers, and Leviticus 19:34. The foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native-born. The former governor's face was beginning to show strain. Now, Governor, Crockett said, you've questioned whether I've really spent time with Scripture. Let me ask you something. In your support for certain economic policies, how do you reconcile that with Jesus' clear teachings about wealth? I'm thinking specifically of Luke 6:20-26, where Jesus says, blessed are you who are poor, and but woe to you who are rich. Or what about James 5:1-6, where James writes, now listen, you rich people, weep and wail because of the misery that is coming on you. The wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The audience was completely captivated now. Congresswoman, Huckabee said, his voice losing confidence, I think you're taking those passages out of context. The Bible certainly doesn't condemn wealth or success. Look at Abraham, look at Job, look at David. These were wealthy men who were blessed by God. Crockett was ready. You're absolutely right that the Bible doesn't condemn wealth itself, but it consistently warns against the dangers of wealth and calls for economic justice. Yes, Abraham was wealthy, but look at how he used his wealth. He was generous to strangers. He negotiated for the lives of the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. Huckabee was beginning to look uncomfortable. And Governor, Crockett continued, if we're going to talk about biblical economics, we should probably discuss the year of Jubilee from Leviticus 25, where God commanded a complete redistribution of wealth every 50 years, or Isaiah 10:1-2. Woe to those who make unjust laws, to those who issue oppressive decrees, to deprive the poor of their rights. The studio was electric with tension now. Crockett wasn't just defending her faith. She was demonstrating biblical literacy that was making Huckabee's questions look shallow. I have to say, Congresswoman, Huckabee said, trying to regain his footing, you certainly know your verses. But knowing Scripture and understanding its application are two different things. It was meant to be a put-down, but Crockett's response would prove to be the moment that changed everything. Governor Huckabee, she said, her voice becoming quieter but more intense. You're absolutely right that the Bible is more than political talking points. But I have to ask you, when was the last time you read the Bible in a language other than English? The studio fell into an almost sacred silence as Crockett paused, her eyes never leaving Huckabee's increasingly uncomfortable face. The former governor was fidgeting with his pen, a nervous habit that his decades of political experience usually helped him control. But this wasn't a typical political debate, and Crockett was far from a typical opponent. Governor, Crockett said, her voice taking on a tone that was both respectful and devastatingly direct. You've built your career on being the authority on biblical faith in politics. You've written books, hosted shows, and advised countless politicians on what the Bible really says about governance and policy. But I have to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly, because the American people deserve honesty from their leaders. Huckabee straightened in his chair, trying to project the confidence that had served him so well for decades. Of course, Congresswoman. Ask me anything, Congresswoman. Ask me anything. When you quote Romans 13 to support unlimited governmental authority, Crockett said, Have you ever considered how early Christians like Dietrich Bonhoeffer interpreted that same passage when they resisted Nazi Germany? Have you studied how black churches in the South used biblical principles to justify civil disobedience during the civil rights movement? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Huckabee opened his mouth to respond, but Crockett continued. Because here's what troubles me, Governor. You seem to use the Bible as a weapon to support predetermined political positions rather than allowing Scripture to challenge and transform your politics. That's not biblical interpretation. That's eisegesis, reading your own ideas into the text instead of drawing meaning from it. Several audience members gasped audibly. Crockett had just accused one of America's most prominent Christian political figures of fundamental biblical malpractice. Now wait just a minute, Huckabee said, his voice rising slightly. I've been studying and preaching the Bible longer than you've been alive. I think I know something about proper biblical interpretation. Do you? Crockett asked, her tone remaining calm but cutting. Then let's test that. Since you've questioned my biblical knowledge, let me ask you some basic questions about the scriptures you claim to know so well. She pulled out a small notebook, the kind seminary students use for biblical languages. Let's start simple. In Matthew 5:3, Jesus says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." But Luke 6:20 records Jesus as saying, "Blessed are the poor." Now, most scholars believe Matthew was writing to a primarily Jewish audience, while Luke was writing to a mixed Jewish-Gentile audience. How do you think this difference in audience affected how each gospel writer recorded Jesus' words about poverty? Huckabee stared at her for a moment. It was a sophisticated question that required knowledge of biblical scholarship, not just memory of favorite verses. Well, he said slowly, I think both versions capture the truth that Jesus cares about spiritual poverty. That's not what I asked, Crockett interrupted gently. I asked about the interpretive implications of the textual differences. If you've really studied Scripture as thoroughly as you claim, this should be basic material. The audience could sense that something significant was happening. Huckabee, the man who had positioned himself as the biblical authority in American politics, was struggling with a question that any first-year seminary student should be able to handle. Let me try another one, Crockett said, her voice becoming more confident. In the Hebrew Bible, the word shalom appears over 250 times. Most English Bibles translate it as peace, but that's a severe reduction of meaning. Can you tell me what shalom actually means and why that matters for how we think about biblical justice? Huckabee's face was beginning to show real stress now. Shalom means peace, he said, clearly hoping to move past the question. No, Governor, Crockett said firmly. Shalom doesn't just mean the absence of conflict. It means wholeness, completeness, justice, prosperity for all people. When the prophets talked about God's shalom, they were talking about a world where everyone has enough, where justice flows like water, where the vulnerable are protected. That's not just personal peace. That's social transformation. She leaned forward, her intensity building. And that's why your interpretation of Romans 13 is so problematic. You use it to defend existing power structures. But Paul was writing about how to live faithfully under unjust authority while working toward God's shalom. The early church didn't just submit to Rome. They created alternative communities that demonstrated God's justice. Huckabee tried to interrupt, but Crockett's momentum was unstoppable now. Which brings me to my real concern, Governor. You've spent decades telling Christians that biblical faith means supporting certain political positions. But have you ever seriously grappled with the Jubilee passages in Leviticus? Have you wrestled with Jesus' words in Luke 4:18-19 when he quotes Isaiah and says he came to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor? She paused, letting the weight of the question settle. Because that passage isn't about personal salvation, it's about social revolution. Jesus was announcing the Jubilee, the year when debts were forgiven, slaves were freed, and land was redistributed. How do you reconcile your political positions with Jesus' explicit commitment to economic justice? The studio was completely silent now. Even the camera operators had stopped moving. Everyone could sense that they were witnessing something unprecedented, a complete reversal of expected roles. But Crockett wasn't finished. She was building toward something that would leave Huckabee completely speechless. Governor, she said, her voice taking on an almost pastoral tone, I want to share something with you that I think gets to the heart of our different approaches to faith and politics. She reached into her bag and pulled out a worn leather Bible. Its pages clearly well used. This belonged to my grandmother. She was a woman who cleaned houses for wealthy families in St. Louis, who raised 7 children on almost nothing, who never had the opportunity to attend seminary or write books about faith. Huckabee watched warily as Crockett opened the Bible, but my grandmother knew something about Scripture that I think you've forgotten, Crockett continued. She knew that the Bible isn't a book about individual salvation and political power. It's a book about God's love for the marginalized, the oppressed, the forgotten. She turned to a well-marked page. Every night she would read to me from Isaiah 58. Let me share verses 6 and 7 with you. Is not this the kind of fasting I have chosen, to loose the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and break every yoke? Is it not to share your food with the hungry, and to provide the poor wanderer with shelter when you see the naked, to clothe them, and not to turn away from your own flesh and blood? Her voice was growing stronger, more passionate. My grandmother used to tell me, baby, if your faith doesn't make you care about hungry people, homeless people, sick people who can't afford medicine, then you're reading a different book than the one Jesus gave us. Huckabee was sitting completely still now, his face pale. The confidence and authority he'd carried into the studio had completely evaporated. And that's my problem with your approach to biblical politics. Governor, Crockett said, closing the Bible but keeping her hand on it. You've turned the Bible into a tool for maintaining power instead of a call to transform society. You quote Scripture to justify policies that hurt the poor, that ignore the vulnerable, that protect the wealthy and powerful. She looked directly into the camera, addressing not just Huckabee but the entire viewing audience. But that's not the God I serve. The God I serve is the one who hears the cry of the oppressed, who brings down the mighty from their thrones, who lifts up the lowly. That's not liberal politics. That's the gospel of Jesus Christ. The silence in the studio was deafening. Huckabee sat frozen, unable to respond. For the first time in his public career, the man who had built his reputation on biblical authority had been completely outmatched by someone who understood Scripture far better than he did. But Crockett had one final statement that would seal Huckabee's defeat and create a moment that would be replayed millions of times. Governor Huckabee, she said, her voice quiet but carrying complete authority. You came here tonight to question my faith. But I think the real question is this. When did you stop allowing the Bible to challenge your politics and start using politics to domesticate the Bible? The question hit like a thunderbolt. It wasn't just a challenge to Huckabee's interpretation of specific passages. It was a fundamental critique of his entire approach to faith and public life. Huckabee opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again. No words came. For several long seconds, one of America's most vocal Christian political leaders sat in complete silence, unable to respond to a challenge from someone he had tried to dismiss as biblically ignorant. Finally, he managed to speak. I've always tried to be faithful to Scripture. But his voice trailed off. Even he could hear how weak his response sounded. The moderator, sensing that something extraordinary had just happened, tried to give Huckabee a chance to recover. Governor, would you like to respond to Congresswoman Crockett's challenge? Huckabee looked around the studio, at the silent audience, at the cameras, at Crockett sitting calmly with her grandmother's Bible still in her hands. The man who had never been at a loss for words, who had built his career on confident biblical proclamations, had nothing to say. I think, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, I think we may need to agree to disagree. It was the most devastating non-response in the history of religious political debate. The man who had come to expose Crockett's supposed biblical ignorance had been so thoroughly outclassed that he couldn't even mount a defense of his own positions. The audience sat in stunned silence. Even Huckabee's supporters couldn't deny what they had just witnessed. Jasmine Crockett had just delivered the most comprehensive biblical challenge to conservative political orthodoxy that had ever been broadcast on national television. And Mike Huckabee had no response at all. The studio lights seemed brighter somehow as the show ended, but Mike Huckabee appeared to shrink under their glare. The confident pastor-politician who had entered the studio an hour earlier was gone, replaced by a man who looked genuinely shaken. As the cameras stopped rolling, he sat motionless for several seconds, staring at the table in front of him as if trying to process what had just happened. Across from him, Jasmine Crockett carefully placed her grandmother's Bible back in her bag, her expression serene but alert. She had not come to humiliate Huckabee, but she had come prepared to defend both her faith and her politics with the kind of biblical scholarship that few politicians possess. What had just transpired would be talked about for years to come. The immediate reaction in the studio was telling. Huckabee's staff members were huddled near the back, their faces showing a mixture of shock and concern. They had expected their boss to easily outmaneuver a congresswoman they assumed knew little about theology. Instead, they had watched him be systematically dismantled by someone who understood the Bible far better than they had imagined possible. Meanwhile, Crockett's small team looked stunned but pleased. Even they hadn't fully grasped the depth of her biblical knowledge. Her chief of staff would later tell reporters, "We knew she was smart, but we didn't know she was a theologian." Within minutes of the show ending, social media exploded in ways that surprised everyone involved. The first clip started appearing on various platforms almost immediately, shared by viewers who couldn't believe what they had just witnessed. The hashtag biblical knowledge began trending within 30 minutes, followed quickly by Crockett School's Huckabee and Bible study. But unlike many viral political moments that divide along predictable partisan lines, this one created unexpected conversations across political boundaries. Conservative Christians found themselves grappling with challenges to their assumptions that they hadn't expected. A prominent evangelical blogger wrote, "I came into this supporting Huckabee, but I have to admit that Crockett demonstrated a level of biblical literacy that was genuinely impressive. Maybe we need to listen more carefully to how other Christians read Scripture." Progressive Christians felt vindicated, but also challenged. Many had assumed that serious biblical scholarship was primarily the domain of conservative Christianity. Crockett's performance demonstrated that progressive politics could emerge from, rather than despite, deep biblical engagement. The most surprising reactions came from biblical scholars and seminary professors. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a New Testament professor at a prominent divinity school, tweeted, "Crockett's exegesis of Romans 13 in historical context was graduate-level work. Her understanding of Hebrew and Greek terminology was sophisticated. This wasn't political theater. This was serious biblical interpretation." Another scholar noted, "Most politicians who talk about the Bible demonstrate surface-level familiarity at best. Crockett clearly has substantial training in biblical languages and hermeneutics. This raises important questions about who we listen to when public figures make biblical claims." The immediate political implications were significant. Conservative media outlets struggled with how to respond. They couldn't simply dismiss Crockett's arguments as biblical ignorance because she had demonstrated superior biblical knowledge. Some tried to argue that her scholarship was too academic, that real faith was about simple belief rather than intellectual understanding. But these arguments fell flat when viewers could see that Crockett's knowledge was grounded in genuine faith rather than mere academic exercise. Progressive media outlets were equally challenged. Many had expected to defend Crockett against religious attacks, not to celebrate her superior biblical scholarship. The story forced progressive commentators to engage seriously with biblical interpretation rather than simply dismissing religious arguments as irrelevant to politics. Mike Huckabee himself left the studio without speaking to reporters, an unusual move for someone who typically embraced media attention. His staff released a brief statement saying that he appreciated the opportunity for dialogue and looked forward to continued conversation about faith and public life. But the statement fooled no one. Huckabee had been comprehensively outmatched, and everyone knew it. 3 days later, Huckabee appeared on a friendly talk show, clearly trying to recover from the debacle. "Look," he said, "I respect the Congresswoman's knowledge of Scripture, but knowing facts about the Bible and understanding its spiritual message are different things. I've been pastoring souls, not just studying texts. But even this attempt at recovery backfired." Crockett's response, posted on social media that evening, was devastating in its simplicity. Studying Scripture without engaging its call to justice isn't pastoral care, it's spiritual malpractice. The prophets would disagree with the governor's distinction between biblical knowledge and biblical faith. The response went viral immediately, shared by thousands of people who had never heard of Jasmine Crockett before the debate but were now following her every statement about faith and politics. Religious leaders across the spectrum were forced to grapple with the implications of what had happened. Some conservative pastors privately admitted that they needed to deepen their own biblical study. Progressive religious leaders found themselves challenged to articulate their own biblical foundations more clearly. The debate also sparked conversations in seminaries and divinity schools across the country. Students began asking their professors why so few politicians seemed to understand the Bible as thoroughly as Crockett did. Faculty members started assigning the debate as required, viewing in courses on biblical interpretation and public theology. Perhaps most significantly, the debate changed how many Americans thought about the relationship between biblical literacy and political positions. For decades, conservative politicians had claimed ownership of serious biblical faith, while progressive politicians had often seemed uncomfortable discussing religion. Crockett's performance demonstrated that progressive politics could emerge from deep biblical engagement rather than secular, humanistic values. Churches across the country reported increased interest in adult education, classes on biblical interpretation. Bookstores saw increased sales of biblical commentaries and books on biblical languages. Seminary applications ticked upward, particularly from people interested in the intersection of faith and social justice. The broader cultural impact was equally significant. The debate had been watched by millions of people, many of whom had never seen serious biblical scholarship demonstrated in a political context. For many viewers, it was the first time they had encountered the idea that the Bible might support progressive political positions. Young Christians, in particular, found themselves energized by Crockett's example. Social media filled with posts from college students and young professionals who had felt forced to choose between their faith and their political convictions. Crockett had shown them that deep biblical engagement could support rather than contradict progressive politics. The debate also had international implications. Religious leaders in other countries noted how American political discourse about religion had been dominated by conservative voices that claimed exclusive biblical authority. Crockett's performance suggested that American Christianity might be more diverse and sophisticated than foreign observers had assumed. Academic conferences on religion and politics began featuring sessions on the Crockett effect, examining how her performance had changed public discourse about biblical interpretation. Political science professors assigned the debate in courses on American political culture, using it to explore how religious authority functions in democratic societies. But perhaps the most lasting impact was on political discourse itself. After Crockett's performance, politicians who wanted to make biblical arguments found themselves held to higher standards. Voters began asking tougher questions about biblical interpretation. Religious voters became more skeptical of simple proof texting and more interested in comprehensive biblical understanding. 6 months after the debate, a major polling organization found that 73% of Americans believed that politicians who quote the Bible should be required to demonstrate substantial biblical knowledge. Another poll found that 68% of religious voters said they were more likely to support candidates who could demonstrate deep biblical understanding rather than just quote popular verses. The debate also sparked a broader conversation about religious authority in American politics. For decades, conservative politicians had successfully claimed the mantle of biblical authority simply by being more willing to quote Scripture in public. Crockett's performance demonstrated that biblical authority should be based on actual knowledge and understanding rather than political positioning. Religious studies professors began incorporating the debate into their courses as an example of how biblical scholarship could inform public discourse. Seminary students started asking more pointed questions about the intersection of biblical interpretation and social justice. Church study groups across the country used the debate as a starting point for deeper conversations about what the Bible actually teaches about politics and social issues. The most significant long-term impact, however, was on Jasmine Crockett herself. Overnight, she had become one of the most recognizable progressive voices in American politics. Speaking requests poured in from universities, churches, and political organizations. Publishers approached her about writing a book on biblical interpretation and progressive politics. But Crockett handled her newfound prominence with the same calm confidence she had displayed in the debate. In interviews, she consistently redirected attention away from her personal triumph and toward the broader issues of biblical literacy and social justice. "This was never about me versus Governor Huckabee," she told one interviewer. "This was about whether we're going to take the Bible seriously when it calls us to care for the poor, the immigrant, the prisoner, the sick. Too many politicians have used selective scripture quotation to avoid the Bible's clear demands for justice." When asked about her biblical training, Crockett was characteristically humble. "I had excellent teachers starting with my grandmother. I was privileged to study biblical languages in college and to continue that study throughout my career. But biblical knowledge isn't about showing off intellectual ability. It's about allowing Scripture to transform how we live and how we treat others." Mike Huckabee, meanwhile, gradually faded from public prominence. His television appearances became less frequent. His social media presence diminished. When he did speak publicly, he seemed more cautious, less willing to make sweeping biblical pronouncements. A year after the debate, he gave a rare interview in which he reflected on what had happened. "I learned something that night," he admitted. "I learned that I had gotten comfortable making assumptions about who understands the Bible and who doesn't. Congresswoman, Crockett taught me that biblical wisdom can come from unexpected sources." It was a gracious admission, though it came too late to restore his reputation as an unquestioned biblical authority. The debate had lasting effects on political discourse more broadly. Candidates began preparing more carefully when they planned to make biblical arguments. Voters became more sophisticated in evaluating religious claims. Political commentators started consulting actual biblical scholars when analyzing faith-based political arguments. Religious leaders also adapted to the new environment. Conservative pastors found themselves challenged by congregants who had seen Crockett's biblical arguments and wanted to understand how to reconcile their faith with their politics. Progressive pastors felt empowered to speak more boldly about biblical social justice themes. The debate even influenced seminary curricula. Schools began offering more courses on public theology and biblical interpretation in political context. Students, preparing for ministry, wanted to understand how to engage political issues with the same biblical sophistication that Crockett had demonstrated. Perhaps most importantly, the debate changed how many Americans understood the relationship between serious Christianity and progressive politics. For too long, conservative politicians had successfully portrayed progressive Christians as either biblically ignorant or unfaithful to Scripture. Crockett's performance demonstrated that progressive politics could emerge from deep biblical engagement rather than despite it. Young Christians in particular found Crockett's example liberating. Many had felt forced to choose between their faith and their political convictions about social justice. Crockett showed them that these didn't have to be in conflict, that biblical faith might actually require progressive political engagement. Churches reported increased interest in social justice ministries. Seminary applications from students interested in activism increased. Christian colleges began offering more courses on faith and social action. The international impact was also significant. Religious leaders in other countries had long wondered whether American Christianity was inevitably tied to conservative politics. Crockett's performance suggested that American Christianity was more diverse and biblically sophisticated than many foreign observers had assumed. As the second anniversary of the debate approached, its impact continued to reverberate through American political and religious culture. Political science professors assigned it in courses on American political development. Seminary professors used it to teach biblical interpretation. Church study groups continued to discuss its implications. Jasmine Crockett, meanwhile, had used her elevated platform to continue advocating for the biblical vision of justice she had articulated that night. She introduced legislation on poverty reduction, criminal justice reform, and immigrant rights, always grounding her arguments in careful biblical interpretation. When reporters asked her about her political ambitions, She remained focused on the issues rather than her own career. "My goal isn't to be famous or powerful," she said. "My goal is to be faithful to what I believe God is calling me to do in this role." But her influence was undeniable. Other progressive politicians began incorporating more sophisticated biblical arguments into their speeches. Religious voters began asking tougher questions about biblical consistency. Conservative politicians found themselves held to higher standards when making religious claims. The debate had proven that American political discourse could handle sophisticated theological argument. It had demonstrated that biblical literacy was not the exclusive province of conservative Christianity. Most importantly, it had shown that serious engagement with Scripture could support rather than undermine progressive political positions. As viewers continued to discover and share clips of the debate on social media, its message continued to spread. The hashtags #biblical justice and faithful politics remained active, with users sharing scripture passages about social justice and discussing the political implications of their faith. The debate had become more than a single political moment. It had become a catalyst for a broader conversation about the role of religious authority in democratic discourse, the relationship between biblical scholarship and political engagement, and the possibility of faithful Christian involvement in progressive politics. And it all started with Mike Huckabee's assumption that a young congresswoman couldn't possibly understand the Bible as well as he did. His shock at discovering how wrong he was had changed American politics in ways that continued to unfold years later. For millions of viewers, the debate remained a powerful reminder that assumptions about religious authority should be carefully examined, that biblical knowledge could emerge from unexpected sources, and that serious engagement with Scripture might lead to surprising political conclusions. The story of that night, when Jasmine Crockett's biblical knowledge left Mike Huckabee completely shocked, had become a defining moment in the ongoing American conversation about faith, politics, and the courage to challenge established authority with careful scholarship and deep conviction. Thanks for watching this incredible story of how biblical knowledge can completely change political discourse. If you enjoyed seeing how Jasmine Crockett used her deep understanding of Scripture to challenge Mike Huckabee's assumptions, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel, so you never miss these amazing moments when politics and faith intersect in unexpected ways. What did you think of Crockett's biblical arguments? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to share this video with anyone who needs to see how real biblical scholarship can transform political conversations.